thank you to Professor Dupuy, and also thank you to my chair, Lindsay May, and also thank you to Jana van der Hoot, who's a third committee member. Also thank you to my friends and family who came and helped, and of course my peers through going through this process for the past year with me. So here we have Dwelling in Diplomacy, Designing a Permanent Place for a Temporary Community. This thesis explores the crossroads of culture and architecture through the design of a U.S. embassy in Algeria. By inserting the embassy into the urban fabric, we can create the opportunity for community, bridging the gap between our locals of the country and our U.S. diplomats. Going a little bit through the agenda, I'll touch upon the built context, going through embassy design and a little bit of its history, the social context, talking about the embassy users, and then I'll go into why I'm using Algeria as a case study, and I'll end with some urban analysis. So the built context, embassy design and history. So the accepted definition of an embassy is a diplomatic mission headed by an ambassador. It's pretty straightforward. It also is in charge of representing America abroad and responding to the needs of our citizens who are traveling or living there. Throughout this process, I've started to redefine what an embassy is. So yes, it is a representation of the U.S. and its current values, but more importantly, it's a vehicle for understanding across and learning across cultures. So at the global scale, it represents the image of the U.S., but at the national scale, it's a collaborative endeavor between the host country and the U.S. And at the community scale, it protects U.S. citizens, and it's a symbol of hope and peace across national and cultural boundaries. So a brief history of U.S. diplomacy. A couple things to note here is that we went through a period of time to where we were investing a lot in our diplomatic architecture, and we were creating pretty open embassies. Transparency was a trend. However, in the 80s, because of the bombings in Lebanon and Beirut, we created some standards that really refined how we were building abroad. And so since then, we've been trying to balance out those two trends between open and closed embassies. So this created the fortress stigma. So in the past, we had standard embassy design that dominated the early 2000s, where it was a deployable model of 3 different sizes, and we would put it into various countries around the world, and we basically neglected the host country's culture and architecture with that. It also tended to isolate embassies from the urban fabric because of the large compounds or large land areas that they needed. It kept them into more suburban environments. That brings us to the present. Through design excellence, the standards that were implemented in 2010, where the most recent example is the London Embassy. And through this embassy, it actually provides public space around the embassy, and so even though it's still it's quite literally an object building within the London fabric, it's providing, on one level, it's still providing a public area for the community around it to connect with it. So the social thank you. I like to hydrate. The social context, so the embassy users. Looking at who's using these embassies, you start to see 4 stages at which they're experiencing the different culture and the different country. So in the honeymoon stage, everything is new and exciting. It's similar to being a tourist. It's probably what we're most familiar with. That moves into culture shock, where the quaint stuff becomes not so quaint, and you start to notice the little differences. And hopefully we move into adaptation and integration, where we're starting to be more comfortable, we forget those differences, and we have a new appreciation for the host country, and we don't have to consciously think about our day-to-day activities. One thing to note here, as these are defined by the United States Department of State guide that they give families of foreign service officers, that there's no prescribed time at which you spend in each stage, so it's a little bit different for everyone with these stages. That leads to 3 types of cultural integration, where I started looking at how 2 cultures blend with one another. And so you have acculturation where one basically dominates another, versus assimilation where there's some mixing. And the hopefulness is in amalgamation where there might be a dominant and a minority, but that creates a new culture of understanding, which you see my family there, and that's what I consider amalgamation. So the people of the embassy. So you have the Foreign Service Officer, who's basically your typical user. The family member of the Foreign Service Officer, and that could be spouse or children. The locally engaged staff, the Marines who are actually housed on site. And then you have a visitor, like someone seeking a passport or a visa, and someone like Yasmin, who's a student a quarter mile away that uses it for English lessons or tutoring. So Algeria as a case study. Why Algeria? Because it represents a rich cultural class. So not only do you have to look at the United States and Algeria, we also have to look at France because of their occupation until the 1960s. I also think this is an opportunity to understand the Arab world a little bit better. So from our perspective of the United States, how can we strengthen that relationship and bridge between the two? And then lastly, access to the embassy. My sister currently works in this embassy, so having access to the social and cultural conditions of it was useful during this process. And just a note on the climactic things. So it's located in northern Africa. It's on the Mediterranean Sea, and I've denoted Rome and Madrid so that you guys are more familiar with that part of the world, I guess. But it has a Mediterranean climate and it has a rainy season, but no snow, really. So I started to look at how, and ask myself, how does culture manifest in architecture? And so I came up with some spatial elements, as well as we'll see some expressive elements in the next slide. But here you see how public or shared space manifests. And so in the vernacular, you can see a courtyard house where that shared space actually exists inside and in the private realm, versus a more Western idea where you have a city square or something that the public space is in the public realm. And then you have circulation, where in the vernacular it's a courtyard schemed where you're circumambulating around that courtyard, versus a more Western idea when I compared it to the row house where the movement is more linear. And then I included some pictures from the site visit here, from Algeria in general, but of some thresholds and how ornate these thresholds can start to be and how they start to articulate them. Likewise, they start to articulate with specific materials, being concrete, and they also have wood, not only because it's the available local material, but in order to stabilize the houses in the Casbah from earthquakes. And then you see in the middle with ornamentation a juxtaposition between how ornate the interior is versus how unornate or bland the exterior is, and how that concrete wall juxtaposes. And then you can see the fenestration and the rhythm and the variations of openings and the connection to the interior and exterior space. I also looked at how this further goes into the wall construction. So our US vernacular of a curtain wall assembly or a steel stud wall versus the Algerian vernacular that the wall thicknesses can grow from 18 to 30 inches of pure stone or terracotta brick. So moving into some urban analysis, here you see the Algiers coastline with the city center spanning across the flatlands along the water. And here you see the existing site outside of that city center area. At the bottom there is the current embassy, of the limited pictures that you can take of an embassy. But that's something to note, is that there are 62 Americans currently working in it versus the 360 Algerians that are working in it. So the existing site also lies within the mountainous region of Algiers, so it's up into the mountains, and it's quite difficult to get there for someone in this downtown area where most of the density is. So you can see where I've proposed the new site. Although it's the same distance from the city center, it's along the density and it's much easier to get to, which I will show here. Again, here's the existing site versus the transportation map, and here's the proposed site Zooming in a little bit further, you can start to see how much public transportation that the new site begins to have in terms of the metro, the train, the tram, a cable car that goes into the mountains, bus stops. It pretty much has access to all modes. For people like Sumaya, who is driving to work, for people like Samir, who takes the train and then walks, the eligible family member Sarah, who takes the tram that drops off right outside the plaza, and then a student like Yasmin, who's walking from the nearby school, and Khalil, who's taking the metro from the Casbah. So the urban strategy here was to identify what assets that the site currently has, 3 of which being the Botanical Garden, the metro stop, and the Sablet Seaview Park. And that Seaview Park is actually being revitalized as we speak. They're trying to create a really nice waterfront that Algiers doesn't really have yet. And so the embassy lies within that, along that critical path from the Botanical Garden to Sablet Seaview Park. So the strategy here continues this green park that it currently exists, and it continues that green plaza onto the site. So the embassy doesn't utilize the entire site, it actually gives back some of that to the public. I also looked at the role of the built edge. And so in the walled culture, like a Middle Eastern city typically is, I looked at how the built edge, meaning building, compares to the walled edge here. And just seeing the variation and differences between the two, you start to realize that the wall of the embassy isn't quite as jarring as it typically is in some other countries that aren't as walled as Algiers. And so with that, I created perimeter conditions of the embassy in order to address the urban scale of this and address the connection to the urban people. And so with a series of grade changes like you see here, or different levels of transparency, and even just simply using native species of Algiers, the perimeter conditions start to create a condition that's not so monotonous as a huge concrete wall existing around the perimeter that is completely standoffish. So here we see the site plan, and walking through how I got to the massing of it, I basically identified a simple mass that is typically centered on site because of the 100-foot setback of embassies. I then organized it, thinking about security and identifying what needs to be the most public versus what needs to be the most private. I then looked at how do I ventilate these buildings. So I pulled the programs apart, made them pretty thin so that we could get light and air between them. And then I reconnect them with a series of links that, like I said, not only reconnected them, but also created a series of courtyards that could be used for different functions. So with that, I direct your attention to the boards we see. Well, here we see the approach of that public plaza that we've given back to the city. And I will note that currently the site is vacant. So one of the important parts of this proposal is that we're not taking away any buildings, we're not destroying any existing urban fabric to implement a United States embassy. Which direction is what? This is looking right here towards the embassy, yeah. So here you see that main approach where this is the main entrance and the consulate entrance exists to the north, further down into the plaza. And so moving through this perspective here, you see that the lobby, this first building is the most public building. So it's the lobby, it's the event space, it's the library up above. It also connects into this event courtyard where designated the courtyard as functioning as a gathering space. So the events spill out into that courtyard and also bridges the gap between the consulate section of the embassy. So if you were a visitor seeking a passport, you would move from the public building through this loggia into the consulate building on the ground floor where you would get your visa. So this environment is one of the most public departments of the embassy, so community liaison, the public diplomacy department as well. as well as this building houses the ambassador on the top floor. And so the ambassador would have access to not only that side, which is the more office environment, but also gives a connection to the most public realm of the embassy. And here, that's where you see the event courtyard, where they would spill out into that space. And the screened element is where the ambassador would reside. So then moving further through, you would see spaces like these throughout. So those are the links that connect all of these buildings through the courtyards. And if you're a visitor, your experience would end here in the consulate waiting room, where you would not have access further throughout the scheme, because this becomes a private realm. So this courtyard then becomes the most private or intimate courtyard, and so varying the heights of these buildings and varying the spaces between them creates unique experiences. And so this one becomes the more shaded area if you need to take a 10-minute break from the office environment. It also shows, this rendering starts to show the prayer rooms that we've implemented, and so it's the opportunity to, one, continue the ground plane between these three buildings, at the same time provide the prayer rooms with a level of privacy and indirect sunlight. And so like I said, this is the more office environment, so this has the rest of the departments in terms of the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, etc., working throughout these 5 floors here. And then it finally ends in the socializing courtyard, where the cafe can actually spill out onto with tables, or it can be a place for happy hours, etc., or events of the more private office environment. With the last building being that cafe, the interior space, and up above it residing the Marines and the health unit for the embassy employees. And lastly, I wanted to touch upon the structure of the buildings. So the most public building, being the first one, would be constructed of steel. I really wanted to, the building materials of Algiers are dominated by concrete, and so I really wanted to show the public what steel is capable of, and just expose them to a material they might not be as familiar with. And so that's where you see the screened element actually extruded from the facade of the public building. The rest of the buildings, I will note, are made of concrete, just because that is their local building material, and I think there's still a need to be sensible to what they have and what they do not have as well. And then you see here through this detail, the wall detail is of a concrete backup wall with limestone cladding. And so the limestone cladding exists basically throughout the scheme. I got that material from one of the buildings I saw along the site. A lot of the buildings Algiers is known for its white stuccoed buildings that are pretty dirty at this point, so they're not so white anymore, but a few of their kind of monumental buildings or iconic buildings are this beautiful limestone that they have. So utilizing that building material was one of the ideas I had along the way. So with that, embassies are important at the global scale because, again, they represent the image of the United States. At the national scale, they represent the collaborative endeavor between two countries, and then at the local scale, they're protecting our citizens. So diplomatic architecture functions as a vehicle for understanding both space and people, a condition that is critical for creating a built environment that spans across cultures and generations to come. Thank you.
Can you explain really well through the site from, west? Yes, sorry. Let me be clear. You did a really nice job of presenting everything. I think this is all really thorough. Can you just explain the areas to the top and bottom of your plan?
Oh, of course, yeah. So like I had said, I started with the perimeter condition, and the wall you see here is extruded based on the extrusions of the of the buildings and seeing how that setback, I can start to push it and pull it and stuff. And then here you see a series of flower gardens. So that was my take on an abstracted version of an Islamic garden, and taking that experience and making it linear through the scheme. Up above you see the more, what I deemed as more of an American or Western idea of the more natural forested area for relaxation or going on a walk, etc. Because in reality, these employees are spending a lot of time on this site. They spend time at home and they spend time here, and so the disconnect there becomes that people aren't getting socialized. So if it's not happening here at the embassy, it's also probably not happening a whole lot with other people at home. And so creating a variety of spaces for people to interact on site.
The wall that you've created here for pushing and pulling, is the model accurate in that you can actually enter the property from the side, or is that?
Sadly, no. So I abstracted it a bit. In reality, it would be like a louvered system, and I've started to show it here. But I wanted to keep it a little bit transparent on the model just to show that idea. And so through the model, you wouldn't get frontal experiences, but you would actually start to see them from the sides and get the experience of the buildings from each direction.
And then the guest experience, if you come in at this point, you're funneled into the building. If you're visiting an embassy, you don't have access to these grounds.
Correct. The visitors are actually coming through this entrance. This would be the main entrance for official diplomats or just embassy employees, rather than someone getting a visa or passport would enter through this one. But yes, I've also inserted walls. I've utilized the wall again, and also the security would be there as well to kind of regulate that.
Does the ambassador have a driver in the limousine?
In Algeria,
like if they're going to a meeting somewhere?
yes, they typically have.
Park on site? Get picked up on site?
Yeah, so the main parking, I have a pointer. The main parking for the employees is up here. However, if you're getting dropped off, like many ambassadors and higher-ups do, you would come along this road, come around, and you would go through this turnabout, get dropped off, and then funnel out again. And so this road is actually large enough to have one lane of parallel parking alongside it if your car needs to be parked for a little bit. But they would use that turnaround here.
But a car does not enter the compound.
No.
So the ambassador, if he or she is going somewhere, they have to come out the gate and get the car.
As it stands, yes.
Is that accepted security-wise?
That's a good question. I don't think I necessarily thought about how a car might need to quite literally get into the compound. My experiences at the embassy currently is that they go through a pavilion here. So this back site, part of the site is the service area. So theoretically they could come in there, but that's the only spot where I allow cars to come in.
Yeah, but there's always those front page pictures of protests outside. The American ambassador rolls by in some drunk large Lincoln or something.
Right.
You know, you wonder a little bit about that. But so in other words, if the ambassador was going out in a limousine, they would get into the car and they're in some secure area.
Over here?
No.
Up here, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple questions for you about the resources that you used. Did you read Architecture for Diplomacy?
I did.
You did. Did you also happen to get access to the Department of State's guides for embassies? It's like a 3,000-page PDF.
I was going to say yes until you said 3,000 pages, because I don't remember it being 3,000 pages.
So, I think your presentation's beautiful and your graphics.
Thank you.
I am not that fluent in the 3,000-page PDF. I've glanced through it. I've worked on older embassies and older ambassador residences. So I was curious as to the placement of the ambassador's residence on the top floor of a middle building, and if you had more to inform us why the placement and within the embassy complex itself.
Sure. I'm actually not suggesting that the ambassador reside on it. I think I used the word reside. I think I had meant just his or her office is there. I am not saying that this is his or her home, because as it stands currently, the embassy is right across from their residence. But I think a major part of this thesis is to look at how we can get embassy employees out into the social context, and so keeping them on site would be a negative in my opinion. So with this scheme, although I didn't plan to where that ambassador would currently reside if this embassy was realized, I think it would still be within the 3-mile limit that the employees have to live within.
Just want to say this is a very complete design and presentation.
Thank you.
And I mean, having the model, it makes it easy for us to sort of comment on it. I do have one comment.
Mm-hmm.
Your section perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a little wacky.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I don't know why you didn't just do a section that has those two parts, or you know, it's just.
Or those pieces of perspectives, or just
something.
Oh, come on, it's
I know.
I battled with this. Yes, it's a fair question. So I had 2 versions of this, to where I had 4 vanishing points, and these were merely elevations to kind of simplify a little bit. But after seeing it, I think it lost some of the spatial qualities that
Absolutely.
the courtyards have with the section
So it should
perspectives.
have just been separate drawings, maybe.
I see.
I
Sure.
totally disagree. I think it does tell a story.
Well, no. It does tell a story, but it's still kind of like,
Oh, it's
you know,
not.
it almost looks like, you know, your plans are
It's like a predella of a medieval altar.
That's fair. I asked, I think, all of my peers.
Michael, I think the problem is that the render of the building sections overwhelms the courtyard space. They're maybe being kind of anemic, and they need similar attention, particularly given the fact that the plan suggests that they are as robust and as well thought
and
out
as important,
as that. So I think
especially in
that's
that part of the world.
Sure, yeah.
So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you.
I have a comment on this. So it's a beautiful presentation, very thoughtful project. Just one comment and then a question for your response.
Okay.
So the comment is, as you all know, Algiers is currently the site of a revolution, the center of a revolution, which makes the public space component in this notion of integrating the embassy and the city even more poignant.
Great.
Just an observation.
Okay.
But the second is, I would differ with you on your characterization of the architecture of Algeria as closed.
Okay.
Because what you're looking at is a very specific courtyard typology that's in a tiny piece, the Casbah, which is now, there's multiple plans for kind of revitalizing the Casbah, have been for 30 years.
Sure.
But the vast amount of urban fabric you've shown is modern. And Algiers, probably more than any other capital in the Arab world, has been the center of modernism for 200 years, right? Experiments like almost 200 years, like people like Corbusier are the most famous. So when you're thinking about, I don't think it's correct to contrast Western typologies and indigenous typologies, because modernism is Algeria, right?
Okay.
And so I think looking at some of the experiments in modernism by Algerian architects or by foreign architects in Algeria is maybe a more accurate way to kind of portray your precedent studies.
Sure.
Specifically, I find the mashrabiyya kind of, the abstracted mashrabiyya layered onto the limestone wall, very compelling. The series of linear courtyards is really beautiful. What I do have a problem with are those arches. They look like they're taken from some mosque somewhere, and I don't see, they don't fit in with the language. And they're only 4 inches thick.
And she's running away. She's running away.
Thank you for your comments. I do appreciate it. I do agree that a lot of Algeria does have I did characterize it by its vernacular and its courtyard house, and after visiting it, it did have a lot more of high-rise apartment buildings that I didn't necessarily expect to see, so I think that's a fair comment to make. Thank you. In terms of the arches, it's another thing I went back and forth on and trying to figure out how to represent this. And it was my attempt to figure out how to bridge the gap between not only the Algerian and the US, but also the French idea of a loggia and representing that as well. And so I think it's something I can look further into and figuring out what that happy balance is with that element.
Did you, well, first of all, I'm sorry. Very clear presentation. I want to reiterate that. I think that today this is probably the strongest presentation in terms of just us reading it. Line weights, everything from line weights to your actual process work, models. Models are great. It's just very thorough, very clear.
Thank you.
I think anyone's in the room who's going to present next year needs to look at your presentation. Just in terms of how clear it is.
Thank you.
I really think you're hitting on something really beautiful here in terms of this sort of the critical regionalism, saying how do you interpret the necessity of the regional architecture? And the architecture is not just an image, right? It's an actual reaction to either cultural traditions and the environment. Mm-hmm. And you're interpreting that. And I think you've started to do a really good job of it. I would be a little more unrelenting. I think where you're unrelenting is the strongest part. Is that you're basically taking this weave, and I talked about tapestry with Kelly, I think it was, on the bridge, but this kind of taking this warp and this weft and this weave and really just pushing it out. And it's where you do things like that. Where, it didn't have to end there, but you just extended it. That's really a beautiful moment. And where you start to see that come across, or that come out, this going through. And things just don't end because they have to end, like here. That's an unfortunate moment, and also the parking lot. Really, you didn't just, before you just put this in your portfolio, just extend every line and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And even in the sidewalk, if that pattern starts to appear out there, the project starts to reach out to the city. It doesn't become a wall, but this becomes a change in material that comes out and changes material there. The sidewalk changes, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just go with it, go for it. Okay. You have a fantastic project, and yeah, you're there, but keep going.
Thank you.
Can I make one comment about the comments that were made about the loggias?
Sure.
Aside from the character of it, the paper-thin quality of it, I think probably they could do more to engage the buildings and actually make places in the buildings that people would inhabit. As far as I know this culture, people, it wouldn't be unusual for people to, given the time of day, to spend time in one of those loggias if it was designed correctly. And they seem to be these kind of funny little hyphens between the buildings. But in actual fact, I think if they engaged the building facade more and had more of a study of the sort of how the sun hits them, where you would sit outside in the winter versus the summer, and things like that, I think it would be more convincing. Right now, the problem I have a little bit is that these four buildings define these courtyards, but I'm not quite sure how the lowest level of the buildings really engages these courtyards. It's a little bit unclear. And I think what you would find if you went back and looked at the way the traditional buildings, courtyard buildings was part of our work, is you would find these things actually wrapping the courtyards, and they could still connect the four different pieces together, but they would engage the space of the courtyard in a way that, Mediterranean culture, it's always ambiguous about what's inside and what's outside. Right? So, and it would be more of that sort of, we can open the windows up and inhabit the loggia as part of the inside some months of the year, part of the outside other months of the year. And if it did more of that, I think it would make those spaces better.
Okay, thank you.
I kind of want to ask you about this 100-foot setback rule, because I think it's forcing the plan into kind of a symmetry that maybe is necessary or maybe isn't necessary. It's like we're borrowing this out from the walkways sort of equidistant on each side. It made sense just because you have to be 100 feet back from the property, is that right also?
Correct. So I started to push that boundary on these three sides. It satisfies the 100-foot setback, and something I would like to explore more is how far I can push this this setback and how close I can get to that. So right now it is probably around 60 or 70 feet rather than the full 100 feet, which I don't think I went far enough with that because it still appears to be the 100-foot setback. But the pushing and pulling of it, yes, was dependent on the setback, but I did try to vary which ones were pushed more than the others. At one point, these two buildings were flush with the main circulation here, but extruding those out allowed for a difference in materiality and kind of just a difference of massing of it, not having a flat facade. But that started to get lost.
We have a variation in height. So
We do. Yeah.
Relentless.
Mhm.
Two more comments. I kind of wish the front public area was actually better connected, and we seem to introduce some barriers to actually being able to circulate linearly along the street.
North-south?
Yeah,
or east-west?
It's difficult to circulate north-south because of pools of water and little planting strips.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. Okay.
And then the last question is kind of a philosophical question. What is it that makes this building American? What do you think is...
I think I tried to make this one the most American building. Like I said, in terms of the structure of it and in terms of extruding the structure on the exterior of the building and actually exposing it as well. I would say that's the most American part of it. To answer.
I mean, why isn't the screen like, Stars and Stripes or something like that?
That was the screen design. I think I'm open to. It's kind of still open. I don't think the screen design doesn't necessarily have to be that pattern, which is why I've denoted a couple of the other typical tiles or some of the tiles of the many hundreds of thousands designs Algerians make.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Picking up on the trellis and the patterns and the screens, I think that although, first of all, this looks like an embassy here, right amount of solid wall. If you look at the very modern Algerian stuff, it's in more international style, you'd have a hard time selling it, I think, to the State Department. But the trellis itself is really a great start. I think it has some issues in its scale. The large scale part seems a little too large. The frame holding it seems really heavy. One way to make it feel more modern would be to play down the frame and make it disappear behind it and just see it as a modern plane. And then you wonder if it was mentioned the hyphens.
Yeah.
What if where the arches are, that region, became trellis, which would provide more shade in the walkways.
Sure. Yeah.
And then just talk about maybe bringing that around, somehow into the courtyards. It's a beautiful project. I have only one more kind of criticism of it, which is that I think the public courtyard, with where big functions would spill out, should be all on one level.
Okay.
Because you're going to have cocktail parties and whatever they serve over there, but it needs to have it's cut up in a way that it's really for large crowds.
Yeah, one thing I was battling is that there is about a 10-foot drop off from one end of the site to the other of the site. So each building, it steps down 1 meter between the buildings, and so that's something I was battling with in terms of this specific courtyard. But
one other comment, you mentioned that the front bar that doesn't have a 100-foot setback. If you didn't do the drop-off lanes, but instead have a lay-by off of the road, and so that everyone got dropped off there, because we know that Vassars don't come in a secure way,
right.
So you don't have to worry about it. But so if you have the drop-off just as a lay-by from the road, that would then be your edge, and you would measure your 100 feet as you have it, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so the setback is a little ambiguous between where it starts, because it supposedly starts at the anti-ramp barrier, which I've located on that farthest layer.
Basically a truck bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like right
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just really quickly, echo another critic's comment about the setbacks and pushing and pulling those up and down. Don't get me wrong, there are setbacks, but it's a thesis.
Yeah.
So you can explore, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I think there could be some really dynamic spaces created between, say, volume 1 and 3, where you might have another different space that you could start to layer and overlap. And then the other thing is, I think in your sketches over there, but I can't really see, were you looking at kind of rotating some of them?
Yeah.
All of them on the inside, and what that?
Right.
Why did you stick to the parallel?
So yeah, that was an exploration that came on a little bit later, and I was looking at kind of the rigidness that this design had created, and I just wanted to explore what if I wanted to connect. So I was thinking of, okay, if the consulate entrance is in this second building, do I want that to be tilted a little bit to make that walk or that experience a little bit shorter, so that they're not doing that. So I explored what happens when I tilt various buildings to see if I could connect two different functions of two different buildings a little bit more. I had decided to not do that for a couple of reasons. I think the purity of the facades of the south, from the south elevation, I think it was really compelling of just the pure forms, and it addressed the existing urban fabric. So it kind of acknowledged these smaller scale buildings that were existing around the site. I also saw the angle of tilt to be an opportunity for the prayer rooms. So to orient them according to the Qibla, that's where I started to get my angle of funk, as you will.
Where are those little buildings there?
Where? These back here?
Those are? Yeah,
These back here? No, those are facilities. So they have to house like furniture for the diplomats to use in their apartments. They have to have storage. Yeah, they have to have storage and stuff like that. And so that's what those pods get.
Might be your next question. Did you have more time than everybody else, or or did you organize everybody to help you?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't think I have more time. Thank you.
Alia, echoing everyone's comments, I think it's a really beautiful presentation. I would love to see the tectonic relationship between the steel and the sort of mass played up a little bit more. I feel like the sections feel like they need to be put on a happier for the portions that are what you call sort of the masonry buildings. And you know, we have a client that we built a house for here, and she's from Morocco, and she said, you guys build with sticks here. This is crazy. So I think fattening those walls and fattening the ceilings, even if they don't necessarily need it, would help to sort of, you could imagine that there might be more depth to some of the windowsills, and I think that it would just start to take on a very different character than some of the other steel pieces. Sure. And then I wanted to go back to Matt's comment. You talked initially about threshold a little bit. And so I think if you created these amazing sort of the front threshold and then this beautiful carved out top outdoor seating space, and then done the same down here, and the same down the bottom. And I think if you give that thickness to some of these heavier pieces at the top, that'll start to read even better. Okay. Maybe that's something that in just a straight section that might read a little bit better, because those pieces are really elegant the way you've kind of like seed out and on either side of the courtyards. And then taking that sort of same threshold approach and thinking about this perspective here, because it's just so anemic. And so you could imagine sort of benches carved out of it, or archways that are, instead of maybe arching this way, maybe you do something that starts to manipulate the ceiling plane that's vaulted, and again is sort of carved out. Although I liked Amy's comment of the sort of lighter breezeway too. So
thank you.
Yeah, beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
did you ever look at an orientation? Did you always have?
Okay, do you want to say something?
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Just one question, just last question. Was the orientation always like this, or did you ever look at orientation, or does it matter in Algeria that the sun, it's not necessarily an ideal orientation? In terms of energy consumption stuff, is that an issue?
Oh, I see. To answer the short way, they kind of always migrated towards this because I knew after studying at the urban scale that this road was going to be way too busy to do anything off of. And so it naturally gravitated towards that edge, which gravitated towards the rest of the scheme, if that answers your question. Yeah.
So one detail about your shadows.
Sure.
I don't get them. If you're coming from the west, then they would be longer and they should be different widths according to heights of your building.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that's important because that affects how those courtyards really are in terms of sun and how the heights of the buildings affect that. And sorry, Katie, to jump in. I've been sitting here puzzling about that.
Okay, thank you.
I've been liking your middle courtyard there, and as we've been talking, and I was harking back to your comment about wanting to find something French to bring in, and I don't know the French impact on Algeria. I was starting to think about all your courtyard spaces and your landscape spaces, and if you had looked at French garden design, modern contemporary French gardens, and how they, play with the landscape, create rooms and spaces, because you have a lot of compartmentalized. You've got at least 20 different gardens on your site.
Right.
And then I was also making a comment about maybe you're vaulting this differently, some other French precedents that have vaulting or trellises, treillage.
Probably does. Liberate.
Yes. Right. To answer your question, I didn't look as thoroughly into French gardens. I did, so that botanical garden that isn't too far from the site actually has it's like half French, half, I don't even know what you would characterize the other half as, but so I got to experience that a little bit, but I didn't necessarily implement it into the gardens. I kind of stuck to the idea of an Islamic garden versus an American landscape, just because I think I was more interested in really getting to what an Islamic garden was or how to implement it.
Really briefly, obviously goes without saying, you should be very proud of the work you've done. The presentation is very easy to follow.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed just sitting here and looking at it. The one comment that I would still push you a little bit further on is on the American building, if you will. I wish you had pushed that still construction idea a little bit further. Particularly, I love the screen that you've come up with, whether it stays in that form or has stars and stripes, whatever. The idea of having this floating metal screen beyond the building is quite nice. And then if I look at your section over here, it's a slightly more mundane building behind the screen. And so it would have been kind of cool if the steel had been more on display on that building as well. Because you get 100-foot setback. 100-foot setback is satisfied. So why not have more glazing? Why not think about how at nighttime, if there are public functions going on, the light coming from inside the building comes to bleed out through that screen, and how it becomes a little bit more of just the decorative element. But other than that, I think it's really good presentation. So.
Sure, thank you.
I want to just build on that comment by Marcus, because I was thinking about thinking, it feels like that first building, the American building, and the way you think about layering, is this idea of kind of moving through layers, and that those layers are, in a way, the kind of, the two cultures kind of somehow coming together. So there's the potential on this question about what is American and what is Algerian, and diplomacy is about the kind of connection, between the two, the meeting of the two. I wonder how you could push that idea more in the architecture, and maybe it's through the materiality, and maybe it's through a different spatial sense, and maybe it's through the way you move things. And so also in the fact that your layout of your plan is a series of layers that moving through these layers, and perhaps the transformation of the cultural balance of the spaces, through the references, both in terms of the way you're planting and the kind of spaces. And what's possible, say, with steel in terms of span, versus what's possible in the scale if you're working in concrete. And so it feels like the seeds of that idea are the next things you're going to really start pushing on in terms of architecture, this kind of cultural diplomacy and exchange.
Sure. Thank you.
For anybody that will be presenting in the future, for me anyway, I believe I've spoken to a couple other people today about it, process is critical for us to see, and hand sketching is critical for us to see. Anything can be done pretty in the computer, but seeing that there's actual thought that comes out of your head, moves down your arm, and finds your pen, and finds it on paper, is critical. So applaud for putting that on here. Yeah, put it in digital format and show it, but show it. And the models. Thank you. Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, yes, oftentimes, just for the students, lots of times when people are looking at portfolios, if they see that kind of work, it gets their attention.
Yeah, I wanted to build on the ongoing conversation we're having about culture and cultural interaction, these different architectural styles, and it occurs to me now that it really is a complicated historical problem in Algeria, because you have the international style and you have Corbusier. There is also a stigma attached to that, to colonial architecture, but then Algeria is also responding to it and they're putting out their own architecture that's like that, as Michelle said. Then you have the layer of pre-colonial architecture and vernacular that you want to engage with. And I think this is an opportunity to deliver some kind of strong critique along those lines. Whether, you don't want to take a vernacular architectural idea and just have it be window dressing around international style, for example. That sends the message of cultural appropriation.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the main discursive thread that seems to be floating to the top here, and something to keep pushing on.
Yeah, of course, definitely. Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt now and then let Lindsay conclude this conversation. I want to thank the guest reviewers who came out and spent the day with us, and I think they certainly deserve a round of applause. Normally I would do that when I introduced you, and I apologize for disrupting the flow of the commentary. But now I'll turn it over to Lindsay. Oh, I should mention that tomorrow we start at 9 o'clock. We have 8 candidates who are going to present their theses. And so come early, stay late. And now, Lindsay.
Thanks, Carl. So I had the pleasure of working with Alia for this semester on this project. And I think we've all had the collective pleasure of talking about the project with you today, but I had the pleasure of getting to work with you over the semester, and I'll just share some of what that was like. Every time we worked together, Alia brought a stack of trace. We would talk about something, and I would say, yeah, that, it's nice to see these bars rotated, but I wonder what happens to the elevations. She'd be like, oh, I looked at that, and here it is. So it was always anticipatory, it was always energetic, and that meant we really got to have design conversations about what happens to those wedges, courtyards. How do you represent these courtyards? Is it the section or is it the perspectives? So we're really able to talk about the stuff that we should talk about, and we want to talk about as chairs rather than being taskmasters or sort of deadline reminders. So that's sort of a process anecdote, but I think in general you've worked so hard and you should be really proud of all the work you've made. I think there is a statement in here about amalgamation of cultures in architecture, and I think as you document all this, as you rest, as you reflect on this process, I hope you are able, and through your career as you work on projects like this and others, that you become sort of more and more comfortable and more confident and more ready to just define what that is for all of us. So thank you, Alia, and congratulations.
Thank you.